Your first airbrush. Don't cheap out. Look, there's airbrush compressor combos on Amazon for like 50 bucks. Don't buy one of those. If you don't have an airbrush, probably something you don't realize is you're going to have to clean your airbrush out every time you use it. And I don't mean just running some thinner through it. I mean actually breaking it down, unscrewing the body, taking out the needle, cleaning individual component parts and putting it back together again. If you get a cheap airbrush that's made out of soft material, isn't machined to fine tolerances, it's going to be a pain to take it apart, put it back together, it's going to break. So that's reason number one, not to buy a cheap airbrush. Now for the same reason, cheap materials, you don't want to have a cheap airbrush because you're going to be using solvents that could easily corrode the brush, destroy the brush if it's not made of stainless steel. So if you get an airbrush that's made out of plastic, lacquer thinner, acetone, and other solvents are possibly just going to melt the airbrush. So you don't want to have a cheap airbrush for that reason. Additionally, the seals in the airbrush are potentially going to be impacted by those solvents if they're made out of cheap materials. And those seals are going to break down faster as the airbrush ages, regardless of what solvent you're using, and you're going to end up having to try to replace them. Now, another reason to buy a decent airbrush is you want to have a company that you can get spare parts from. I've never had to buy any spare parts. I've been airbrushing for decades. However, that could happen, or you might want a different nozzle or some replacement needles or something like that. Well, good luck getting that from whoever built that airbrush for you that you bought for 25 bucks on Amazon. Don't buy an airbrush because you like the way it looks, because it looks cool, because it's black. No one's going to see you airbrushing. You want practicality. You want an airbrush that's made out of stainless steel, that is going to resist solvents. You can take some lacquer thinner and clean off any paint that might get on it without destroying the finish. If you get a airbrush that's been painted or has some sort of an anodized finish on it, well, it's quite possible that that could come off in the rigors of use, and you're going to have an airbrush for a long time. So get a decent one that will stand up to the wear and tear that is ordinary in the course of using an airbrush. I'm really excited about this series I'm doing about your first airbrush. In addition to this one about why not to buy cheap. Number 2 will be about what features you should look for in your first airbrush. Number 3 will be about air supply options. And number 4 will be about ventilation and safety. But the good news is that whatever features you need, you're not going to have to spend more than $100 to $150 to get an airbrush. That's a good one. Now that doesn't include the power supply. But look, the likelihood is you're watching this video on a cell phone that costs in the neighborhood of $1,000. It's going to be obsolete in a couple of years. The battery is going to be no good and it's not replaceable. So if you're willing to spend $1,000 on that, you should be willing to spend $100 to $150 on a decent airbrush that will last you for decades if you take care of it. So we're not talking about a major investment, but we are talking about being smart. You know the old saying, buy it nice or buy it twice. Well, that absolutely applies to airbrushes. If you like this content, please consider hitting the subscribe button, give me a thumbs up. Hit that bell icon to be notified of future videos in this series about your first airbrush. Until next time, Bob Johnson with PK&W Model Works signing off. Keep on modeling.